Vintage art and textured art are two distinct styles that can be combined to create a unique and visually interesting piece of art. Vintage art refers to artwork that is inspired by the styles and techniques of a particular historical period, typically the 19th and early 20th centuries. Vintage art often incorporates elements of traditional art techniques, such as classical painting, printmaking, and illustration. When combined, vintage art and textured art can create a visually interesting piece that combines the traditional techniques of vintage art with the depth and dimension of textured art. For example, a vintage-style illustration could be given a textured look by adding cross-hatching and stippling to the lines and shading, or a vintage painting could be given added depth and interest by incorporating textured materials into the surface of the canvas. Here are some examples of vintage art and textured art being combined in different mediums. Painting. An artist could create a vintage-style landscape painting, using traditional techniques such as oil painting and brushwork, but incorporating textured elements, such as impasto or collage, to add depth and interest to the composition. Printmaking. A printmaker could create a vintage-style etching or lino cut, incorporating traditional printmaking techniques, but adding textured elements, such as hand coloring or embossing, to give the print a unique and tactile quality. Illustration. An illustrator could create a vintage-style illustration, using traditional techniques such as pen and ink, but incorporating textured elements, such as cross-hatching and stippling, to add depth and interest to the lines and shading. Mixed media. An artist could create a mixed media piece, combining vintage elements, such as an old map or postcard, with textured elements, such as collage, stitching, or paint, to create a unique and visually interesting piece of art. Max Ernst, Au Rendez-vous des Amis, 1919, an oil painting that combines elements of vintage art with textured elements such as impasto and collage. Pablo Picasso, Still Life with Chair Caning, 1912, a mixed media painting that incorporates elements of vintage art, such as classical still life composition, with textured elements, such as collage and impasto. Edvard Munch, The Scream, 1893, an etching that combines vintage elements, such as traditional printmaking techniques, with textured elements, such as hand coloring and embossing. Mary Cassatt, The Child's Bath, 1893, a dry point print that combines vintage elements, such as classical composition and line work, with textured elements, such as the rough surface of the dry point plate. Arthur Rackham, Grimm's Fairy Tales, 1909, an illustration series that combines vintage elements, such as pen and ink line work, with textured elements, such as cross-hatching and stippling. Beatrix Potter, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, 1902, an illustration series that combines vintage elements, such as traditional watercolor painting, with textured elements, such as the rough surface of the paper. By combining elements of the past and the present, these artists were able to create unique and visually interesting pieces of art that capture the best of both worlds.